The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. 2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, had taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since.
President, could you tell us how the tide is being turned in the case of the American hostages in Tehran?
Well, we haven't made adequate progress there. What we've done since the very beginning is to try to protect the lives and safety of those hostages from the original threats that they would be tried and executed, to build up on a worldwide basis support for our position, the condemnation of Iran, and the calling on the Iranian government to protect those hostages and to release them, and to have an adequate commitment in our own nation's military strength and otherwise, other strength, to protect those hostages and to expedite their release.
A new and daring element was disclosed today in the Iran crisis, which has held world attention for 87 days now. And that's the way it is. Tuesday, February 19th, 1980, the 108th day of captivity, the 222nd day of captivity, the 285th day of captivity, the 377th day of captivity for American hostages in Iran.
As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever.
Now, day one. Day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today. The new president had not been in office an hour when the former hostages became free men and women again. And they are well along now on their trip to West Germany and eventually to home.
It was a long and harrowing ordeal for the hostages, their families, and indeed the entire nation. And it was an ordeal that plagued the presidency of Jimmy Carter, an ordeal whose final resolution eluded his presidency by less than an hour. More on this story from Robert Pierpoint at the State Department.
President Carter worked in the Oval Office throughout the night and before dawn this morning signed the executive orders that triggered the hostages' release. His signature removed one final obstacle discovered by Iran yesterday, which might have prevented the Iranians from receiving money that rightfully belonged to them long after the hostages were home. Once this problem was resolved, the president ordered the flow to begin of nearly $8 billion in Iran's frozen assets to the Bank of England.
Right on, man. That's great. That's great.
And that's the way it is. Tuesday, January 20th, 1981, a day that began as the 444th day of captivity and ended as the first day of freedom for the American hostages in Iran. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, reporting from Washington. Good night.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all the...
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Lieutenant Colonel Jim Wilbanks. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 106, The October Surprise, with Barbara Honegger. Our guest tonight is Barbara Honegger, who will join us next in the midnight hour. But right now, let's tidy up our little humble abode, shall we? Now, this will be the final episode of the Midnight Rider News Show in 2018, and if our counts are correct, and I hope they are, this is the 66th episode of the year. Now, we started 2018 by interviewing Clara Bingham about her book, Witness to the Revolution, and I'd really like to say this about that episode. That episode has not done that well on our download numbers, but Clara is really good on it. Really good. And the book, and thus the episode, is about that important 1969-1970 school year and all the monumental events happening on college campuses around America. It was a radical year in America. And we also added a lot of music of the era to that one, so it's one of our better produced episodes as well, and I just think the world of that one. So if you haven't heard it yet, you should make it a point to listen to it over the next week or two, and we won't be releasing any episodes during that time period. So it's worth it. It really is. I promise you that. So yes, your friendly neighborhood host needs a small vacation, and I need it badly. Now, we've been going nonstop since day one, and I can actually remember editing an episode on Christmas Day last year. And well, this has been an even far better year for the show than I'd expected, but I am tired, and while I won't be going to Las Vegas or anything, I will be promoting the inaugural issue of Deep Truth Journal, more on that later, and I will be planning issue 2, and okay, I'll also be playing quite a bit of Stratomatic baseball as well, but that's what statistical junkies do. But really, I'm also going to do some heavy reading, which includes the new one by Lisa Peace, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. You all should get that one. Fantastic. The Deep State in the Heart of Texas by Richard Bartholomew, one of the more underrated books ever in the history of Kennedy assassination works. And of course, the many works on Watergate, which I go through continuously anyway. So I always have those around. That said, I will be enjoying these next 2 weeks, but I'm also excited to get back to the show. And as we did last year, we'll upload our 2018 theme, which you heard at the beginning of the show tonight for the last time. And 2019 will, per usual, bring new clips to that theme music. And I think you're going to like those, so make sure to listen to the theme in the next episode. And speaking of the next episode, the first episode of 2019, for those who are curious, is a happy one for me. My friend Douglas Horn will be back on the show, making his case that the Zapruder film has absolutely been altered. What a good way to kick off the year. But tonight, we have a show that I've been wanting to do since the inception of Midnight Rider News, and that's Barbara Honegger, The October Surprise. And we'll be right back with that.
Hi, this is Clara Bingham, author of Witness to the Revolution. For more on the radicals, resistors, vets, and hippies that awakened America in the year that it lost its mind and found its soul, listen to episode 41 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Barbara Honegger is also someone I just recently met for the first time in Dallas. And see, folks, this is why you should absolutely attend these conferences. You do meet a lot of people. Now, Barbara has become one of the world's leading experts on 9/11 and especially the situation at the Pentagon. But the thing that I first noticed was her 1989 book, The October Surprise. Now, Barbara Honegger worked as a researcher at the Hoover Institution before joining the Ronald Reagan campaign as a researcher and policy analyst in 1980. And Honegger then headed Reagan's Gender Discrimination Agency review before resigning her post in August of 1983. Now, while working for Reagan, she discovered information that convinced her that George H.W. Bush, the vice president at the time, and William Casey, Reagan's first CIA director, had conspired to make sure that Iran did not release the U.S. hostages until Jimmy Carter had been defeated in the 1980 presidential election. That is the October Surprise. Now, she took a lot of fire for this work, and she was the first to release a book on this, as I'm sure she'll discuss tonight, so she really did put herself out there on this. Over the years, however, much of her work has been confirmed, a topic we will also discuss tonight, so let's get right to it. Barbara, how are you this evening?
Well, hi, ST. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and I'm actually quite excited to be talking about this because the October Surprise is an important story, the reverberations of which we still feel today all across the spectrum of our geopolitics. But you have an interesting perspective on this story because you were not just an interested researcher. You were working within the Reagan campaign in 1980 and then the White House from 81 to 83. But before we go into what is now known as the October Surprise, I'd like to know a little bit more about you, and I'd like to tell everyone out there a little bit more about you. So if you could, talk a little bit about your background.
Okay, I will do that, and I'm going to preface that, if I may, with why people should care about this now, because that, actually this happened many decades ago, didn't it? This matters now, ST, because regardless of where you fall on the American political spectrum, we have a serious situation with President Trump, and he is being investigated, as you know, for allegations of collusion with Russia in the 2016 campaign. Now, the mainstream media in this country, our newspapers and our mainstream television channels and networks, they all parrot the same line, which is, this is totally unprecedented. It has never happened before, the mainstream media and press claim, that a American presidential campaign has ever, according to the Mueller side, has ever secretly and treasonously negotiated with a hostile foreign power to influence and steal a presidential election. That is not true. The first time we know that it happened is the October Surprise, when exactly that happened in October of 1980, in the lead up to October of 1980, when the Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. campaign that was then running for the presidency against President Carter negotiated treasonously with the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime in Iran that was then holding over 50 of our American citizens hostage against their will, having taken over the U.S. Embassy and taken them captive. So it did happen before, and that's why people should care now. So just with that important preface so that people pay attention to this, this is not the first time this has happened in recent American presidential politics. Okay, so you asked me about my background, and yes, you're absolutely correct. Not only am I the author of the first book on the October Surprise, and there are at least 3 others, by the way. There's also my book, October Surprise, which came out on May 12th of 1989, just after George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, became president on January 20th of that year, 1989, and having just won the election against Dukakis on early November of 1988. But there are also 3 other books that we can talk about later, but mine was the first by almost 3 years, yes. So I'm not only the author of the first book on the October Surprise, which has now been borne out, by the way, as we will see at the end of this interview, by formerly classified documents, absolutely validating and confirming it, but believe it or not, deathbed confessions by the former head of French intelligence who did security for the critical October Surprise treason meeting, but also Dwayne Dewey Claridge, who was then President Bush's, President Bush Sr.'s, one of his top CIA covert operators who was involved with the October Surprise treason back in October 1980. So, yes, I'm the author of the book October Surprise, whose claims have now been validated by formerly classified documents and deathbed confessions of the perpetrators and those involved at the very highest level of the October Surprise. But also, as you said, yes, I was at the very highest level of the Reagan campaign, the Republican National Convention, which was in the summer of 1980 in Detroit, Michigan. I ran the speech writing and policy office there. And then I went on to the national headquarters of the Reagan-Bush Senior Campaign in Arlington, Virginia. I was one of a handful of people who had access to the code numbers at the door to the operations center, where a lot of these the sabotage of Carter's attempts to bring the hostages home was plotted. Where I became aware of it. And then once Reagan and Bush Sr. won the election by this high treason of the October surprise, we then moved into the transition headquarters, which was then taxpayer supported, of course, in downtown Washington, D.C., and I was on the top floor of the transition headquarters. And I was actually one of a handful of top aides to Reagan who was selected by Ed Meese to go into the West Wing of the White House a few days before Reagan and Bush became president and vice president, while Carter was still desperately trying to get the hostages home. So I was actually in the West Wing of the Carter White House, setting up the Domestic Policy Council in those final days of the frantic attempts to bring our hostages home. So yes, I've been all of those places, and so I'm both an eyewitness and an ear witness to the October surprise, but also, of course, followed it up as a really serious investigative journalist after the fact, after Iran-gate started pouring out in the press in November of 1986.
Well, because we have to sort of set these flags out now in our society, I do have to mention this about your ideology. You are not necessarily anti-Republican. You told me in Dallas that you actually admired Reagan very much.
Absolutely. I loved Reagan. I say so in my book. He's one of the most amazing human beings, individuals I've ever met in my life. What many people think about him, that he didn't have a good memory, it's just the opposite. He had an eidetic memory. He was one of the most charming, attentive, personable, gentle, articulate people I've ever met in my life. I actually love the man. Now, did I approve of a lot of his policies? Absolutely not. But yes, I did very much like the man. I was, by the way, totally apolitical when I ended up in the West Wing of the White House. I'd been working at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University simply to earn money to put myself through graduate school at Stanford University in the neuropsychology and neurophysiology of human and non-human primate communication as a scientist. I was working at the Hoover Institution, working with Dr. Martin Anderson there, when Reagan came in and tapped him to be his chief domestic policy advisor in the 1980 campaign. And then, of course, we went off with Reagan with coattails to the Republican convention, the transition, and to the West Wing of the White House, when my mentor and boss at the Hoover Institution at Stanford then happened to become, as fate would have it, Reagan's chief domestic policy advisor, the first one in his first term as president from inauguration day on. So I was Martin Anderson, Dr. Martin Anderson, the chief domestic policy advisor's top aide. I was the special assistant to the assistant to the president, Martin Anderson, and I was also a policy analyst in the West Wing of the White House on the Domestic Policy Council. So, yes, I was there from the beginning. I was, however, apolitical then. I did run for Congress as a Republican here in the Monterey Peninsula of California in 1994, when Leon Panetta, who was our representative for years, left his position in the middle of his term to become President Bill Clinton's chief of staff in the White House. There was a special election. I ran for that. I didn't win. I did very well. And I've run again for Congress here. I am a registered independent, however. You can imagine that I'm an independent individual.
After talking to you a few times, Barbara, I can imagine that. I really can. But we should first set the scene, both in Iran and in the United States in 1979 and 1980. So describe to me, if you would, just what was going on, both internally and externally with Iran. What was going on that led to the taking of the hostages?
Right. Well, this is, of course, decades later, so I'm just going to give you the big picture, which is what your listeners will want to know anyway. For those who were alive then, and I'm in my 7th decade, by the way, For those who are alive and remember, and for those who weren't, I'll give a thumbnail sketch. And that is that when President Carter became president, I believe he won in 1976, so he was running for a second term in the 1980 election. He had already been president for 4 years. During his term as president, we had the OPEC oil crisis, gas and oil crisis, where there were lines snaking around blocks and blocks throughout the United States, and gas was rare, and the prices of gas were skyrocketing. And of course, this when the economy tanks, and it was for that reason, what OPEC was doing, when the economy tanks, it makes it very difficult for a president to win re-election. But on top of that economics picture in the United States itself, on November 4th, 1979, exactly 1 year, and I don't think it's a coincidence, exactly 1 year before the November 4th, 1980 presidential election between Reagan and Bush Sr. and Carter for the presidency, on November 4th of 1979, the Khomeini regime, which just not long before had experienced the Iranian Revolution, where they forced the Shah to flee the country. He came to the United States for cancer treatment, and he was so hated by the people in Iran for many reasons we won't go into, but he was hated by the vast majority of the Iranian people for good reason. He was a dictator, very much like, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is a dictator. So he came to the United States, and that enraged the Iranian people, especially the youth of Iran, and they overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they took, originally, by the way, more than just 52 hostages. The women, people who were sick, women, and there might have been a few children, were released with the intercession of Yasser Arafat of the PLO. But that left between 52 and 53 hostages. There were actually 53. We won't go into that, but people think of it as 52. So the Khomeini regime, these students, these Iranian students, overran our U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took over 50 Americans hostage. And so Carter, in order to win the election, he had to bring those hostages home. Everyone knew that. He was going down and down and down in the polls, on top of the oil and gas crisis, the financial crisis in the United States, the shortage that was artificially created by OPEC in the Middle East, the gasoline and oil producers in the Middle East. So he had to bring the hostages home. And the Reagan-Bush campaign in 1980, where I was the chief aide to the chief domestic policy advisor to then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. I was on the Reagan side of the Reagan-Bush Sr. campaign. And believe me, they were very much two separate sides. When I was in the campaign, in the most secure room of the Reagan-Bush campaign, it was called the Operations Center. In October, mid to late October of 1980, it was actually probably around the 16th of October, mid-October, I was in the Operations Center, where suddenly when I went in, I had to put the codes in the door. You know, it was a secure room. You had to punch in the numbers, the secret code. And I went in there, and my job was to monitor the television for the chief domestic policy advisor, you know, how the campaign and Carter's campaign were being covered by all the networks. And we had all the TVs in there going and blaring at once. And so when I walked in there, it was suddenly a completely different atmosphere than it had ever been before, leading up to mid-October. And the difference is that people were excited. We were worried. We actually believed that Carter would bring the hostages home. And we had done internal polling in the Reagan-Bush Sr. campaign, and we knew from our focus groups and our internal polling from across the country, these focus groups, that if Carter brought the hostages home, between the 18th and the 25th, and I can explain why that was the critical window, that he would get a boost of between 7 and 10 points in the polls on projected for Election Day, and Reagan would lose. Carter would win. So we knew that if we got internal intelligence, that Carter's administration was even trying behind the scenes to get the hostages out, beginning on October 18th and anywhere up to the 25th, we were going to have to do something or we were going to lose for sure. So in mid-October, just before the 18th, when I entered the Operations Center in National Campaign Headquarters in Washington, in Arlington, Virginia, suddenly there was a party atmosphere. And I went up to people and I said, what's going on? What's going on? Of course, I was well known to all of them, being the chief aide to the chief domestic policy advisor to Reagan. And they would say, well, you don't know? And I said, no, what's happening? And a man by the name of Max Hugel, who was there, he was very close to William Casey, and he became chief of covert operations under William Casey as Reagan's first CIA director when Reagan took the White House. Max Hugel was then in the campaign. He was working with William Casey, and he said to me, well, there's not going to be an October surprise. We're going to make sure of that. Now, that stuck in my mind, and I knew that something was happening. I didn't know what, but that was a personal experience that was the absolute fulcrum and anchor to all of my research later, after the Iran-Contra affair started spilling out into the press back in late November, I think November 24th, 1986 was the first inkling of what became the Iran-Contra scandal that rocked the country and almost resulted in Reagan's impeachment. He would have been impeached, by the way, I'm certain of it, if he hadn't survived an assassination attempt shortly after he became president, way back in spring of 1981. So I had this personal experience, and then I remembered that personal experience from inside the Reagan-Bush Campaign National Headquarters Operations Center when Iran-Contra started spilling into the press, and when I heard what Robert McFarlane, who was then Reagan's National Security Advisor, and what Ed Meese, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and what Oliver North were saying, I immediately knew that the just maybe $150 million worth of arms to Iran that were all that was being talked about in the Iran side of Iran-Contra, that those few arms were simply the tip of the iceberg of an arms for hostage delay deal that had been negotiated in the October surprise, and that was what I had been told back in the Operations Center about back in mid-October of 1980. So I put two and two together is what happened, yes.
Well, you have me interested in this now. You said earlier that there might have been a 53rd hostage.
Yes, that's correct.
How so? Who was it?
Well, it's been a while, but here's the gist of it. This is an extra 53rd hostage who was a close personal friend of the National Security Advisor, the first National Security Advisor in the campaign, and became the first National Security Advisor to Reagan when he became president, Dick Allen. Dick Allen and my boss, Martin Anderson, the Chief Domestic Policy Advisor, were best of friends and colleagues. And Dick Allen knew this person. I can't remember her name now, but it was a woman. And she was held back, interestingly. After the 52 hostages were released, she was held back to try to, the Iranians, even after the inauguration day, when, the world believed that all of the hostages were released right after Reagan and Bush took their oaths of office, literally minutes afterwards. It was obviously a quid pro quo. That was part of the under the table October surprise deal. Don't release the hostages until inauguration day. Not only defeat Carter by not releasing them before the election, but then there were additional meetings after the election to prevent Khomeini from releasing the hostages immediately after Reagan and Bush won, to delay them further for another 3 months until Inauguration Day, right after the oaths of office were taken. Yes, there was a 53rd hostage who was a woman, and she was someone very close to the National Security Advisor of the United States, Dick Allen, and there were additional negotiations for her release, with the Iranians making further demands. I can't give you any more details about that right now.
Now, you also mentioned that there was a timetable in October 1980, and it was a timetable wherein if Carter were able to negotiate the release of the hostages, that he would have almost assuredly been victorious in the election.
Correct.
So how did this time frame come about, and what research went into its development?
Well, that's a very great question. It's in, I believe, the first chapter of my book, October Surprise. It's critical to understanding why the Reagan-Bush Sr. campaign did the October Surprise treason negotiation of an arms for hostage release delay deal with the Khomeini regime in the first place. And that is, we knew, that everyone in the world knew, that Carter had to bring the hostages home before the election or he was going to lose. So obviously the Reagan campaign knew that as well. But we had very, very, very high-level, millions of dollars went into focus groups in people's homes around the country. And the question was, they asked the question, if Carter brought the hostages home at this date in October, would you be more likely to vote for Carter or Reagan? And then they would ask the question, move it up a little bit. And what we learned is that if the hostages were brought home by Carter between the 18th and the 25th, he would get this boost in the polls. If it was before the 18th, it would be too far away from the election. People would forget about it. He wouldn't get as much credit. He needed at least a 7% boost, because Reagan was ahead, but he wasn't ahead by 7 points. So if he brought the hostages home before the 18th, he wasn't going to get the boost that he needed. Carter wouldn't. If he brought them home after the 25th, it was, according to our focus group polls, and all that data was fed into a huge computer in Brigham Young University in Utah, by the way, and they crunched all the numbers, and that's how we came out with October 18th to 25th. If they came home after the 25th, according to our focus group number crunching, the public was going to see it as too politically motivated by Carter, and they were going to actually ding him for bringing the hostages home too close to the election of November 4th. So the critical time window was that 18th to 25th. And when our inside spies let us know that Carter was actively negotiating behind the scenes with Khomeini's top representatives on October 18th, we initiated the actual October Surprise, which was a meeting, by the way. This is the critical meeting. There were others leading up to it, yes, but the one that matters was on the night of October 18th to 19th of 1980 in Paris, France, at the Ritz Hotel, which, by the way, was owned by Dodi Al-Fayed's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, and Dodi Al-Fayed died in the car with Princess Diana, right, in the Alma Tunnel in Paris. They were meeting in the same hotel, the Ritz Hotel in Paris, that the October Surprise meeting happened in years earlier. So that is the critical fact of the 18th to the 25th. So we learned from our spies on the inside that Carter was seriously negotiating. So the response, and that's why there was a party atmosphere in the operations center of the Reagan-Bush campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, on around the 15th or the 16th of October. They already knew that they were gearing up to send George Bush Sr., who had been the vice presidential running mate of Reagan, and William Casey, who was then the campaign manager, soon to become Reagan's first CIA director in the Central Intelligence Agency. They were already gearing up on the 15th, 16th of October to send Bush Sr. and William Casey to the critical meeting at the Ritz Hotel in Paris to meet with Khomeini's top representatives to cut the arms for hostage release delay deal. And those arms, by the way, did flow to Iran right after, beginning no later than March of 1981, right after Reagan and Bush Sr. took the White House. Those illegal and secret arms shipments did go to Iran to fulfill the Reagan-Bush campaign's end of the bargain after the hostages were released right after Reagan and Bush Sr. took their oath of office. And there were at least a documented $5 billion worth of secret and illegal arms shipments to Iran during the entire period up to when Iran-Contra started spilling out, leaking out into the press in late November of 1986, years later. Yes.
Well, we know that President Carter had made some attempts to negotiate for the hostages' release, and there was also an attempted military rescue, and the results were ultimately that they failed.
Yeah.
But how close did the Carter administration come to a hostage release or a final negotiation before the election of 1980?
Right. Well, that's another great question. So people need to understand that, of course, there's a critical difference here. I'm going to answer your question, but a little bit of context. There's a critical difference between trying to bring the hostages home as President of the United States when you are authorized and it's your duty to do so on behalf of the entire country, and quite another matter to interfere with the president's attempts to do so as private citizens, which is what Reagan and Bush Sr. were at the time, and William Casey. Okay, so there's a critical difference. Many people say, oh, well, Carter was trying to bring him home. Why shouldn't Reagan, Bush, and Casey try to bring him home? Well, that's the critical difference. Carter was president. Reagan, Bush, and Casey were not. Okay, so to answer your question, of course Carter, throughout the entire time that the hostages were taken, they were taken captive on November 4th, 1979. And by the way, it's critical for people to know that the Iran-Iraq War had just started in September, a month before, okay? So Iraq had sent some kind of ammunition, missile, something across the border into Iran, and Iran retaliated. But the first shot was fired by Iraq, and that began the Iran-Iraq War. So the Iran-Iraq War was ongoing for a little over a month when Khomeini, when the students took the originally over 60 American hostages hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They overran the walls, and they went in and took these people captive. Now, they were originally held by the students captive in the embassy, all in one place. And while they were still, essentially, most of them, all in one place, there were a few in the ambassador's residence as well, but mostly the vast majority were still being held by the students under gunpoint in the embassy itself in Tehran, Iran. So while this was happening, Carter, of course, immediately started negotiating, trying to get them out. That didn't work. And so he authorized a military hostage rescue attempt. All right? And that is known in the public as the Desert One hostage rescue attempt. I believe the official code name was Honey Badger. But in any case, I'll call it the Desert One hostage rescue attempt. And that was in the spring of 1980, well before the October surprise in October 1980. That was in the spring. And what happened there is that Carter's plan, his military plan that he authorized, was that helicopters, a certain number of helicopters that were on board the Nimitz aircraft carrier, they were either in the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. Anyway, they were on the Nimitz. That those helicopters were to leave under cover of darkness, and they were to fly to a landing place inside Iran called Desert One. And that was outside of Tehran by quite a few miles. And then they were supposed to go into Tehran, and they had a plan with special operations forces to overcome the students and get the hostages out. Okay. So that was the military rescue plan. Well, I'm here to tell you that one of the two unpublished chapters of my book, October Surprise, was on the Bush Sr. cabal inside of the CIA's sabotage of Carter's military hostage rescue attempt in the spring of 1980, the Desert One hostage rescue attempt. And the way that was sabotaged is before the hostage rescue attempt began, Carter had his military officers agree that a certain number, a minimum number of helicopters had to make it to the Desert One rendezvous site outside of Tehran in order for the operation to continue, because you needed a certain number of them to get the hostages out along with the pilots and the special operations forces, get everybody out, assuming they could get everybody out. Because 52 hostages is a lot of people, so they needed a minimum number of helicopters. Well, so these helicopters were on the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier. And we know from the Holloway report, which was the investigation of the disaster that happened at Desert One, which was the explosion of one of the helicopters and a refueling plane into a huge fireball with people dying and the Khomeini regime getting a huge propaganda victory against Carter in the spring of 1980. But what happened to sabotage it was on board the Nimitz. So just before the helicopters were to have taken off for the mission, someone pressed the switch. The helicopters were in the hold of the Nimitz aircraft carrier, and somebody pressed the switch that you would press if there was a fire, even though there was no fire in the hold where the helicopters were. And the helicopters were coated with this sticky fire retardant substance. Well, of course, they hosed these down, but they couldn't get it all off in time. They decided to go ahead. And, of course, there was a sandstorm on the way to Desert One, and the sand stuck to the blades of the helicopters where there was still sticky stuff. One of the helicopters crashed. I think another one also didn't make it. Anyway, bottom line is not enough helicopters made it to the site. And Carter was told this, and he called off. He aborted the rescue attempt. But when they were trying to leave, one of the refueling planes ran into one of the helicopters, and there was a huge explosion. Some people died, and there were 8 or 9. The official story is there were 8 people who died, but I'm told by Mansour Rafizadeh, who was the Shah's head of Savak at the United Nations in the United States and close to George Bush Sr., I was told in a one-on-one interview with him in his home in upstate New Jersey that there was a 9th secret person who died on that mission as well. So that is the Bush side of the CIA and the military who worked with them sabotaged Carter's military hostage rescue attempt as well in the spring of 1980. Now, this is an unpublished chapter of my book. There is no conspiracy behind that. I had a contract with my publisher, Tudor Press. They're no longer in business. They became Knightsbridge Press. Sounds British, doesn't it? Which is interesting. Yeah. But anyway, those 2 chapters weren't published because my contract, like any contract with a book publisher, gives a maximum number of pages. It was something like 323. And when you're typing, you don't know what the typeset pages are going to come out at, how many. And it was about 2 chapters over, and they let me decide which 2 chapters to take out. And unfortunately, I had to take that out because it wasn't directly related to the October surprise itself in October of 1980. So I was very sad to take it out. But I do have it for anyone who would like to have it. So to answer your question, yes, Carter tried to bring the hostages home many ways, and the Reagan-Bush campaign and their compadres, their fellow traveler treason artists inside the CIA and our special operations forces sabotaged his military as well as his diplomatic negotiations with the Khomeini regime.
Barbara, I'm intrigued by this idea that there were already 2 very distinct camps developing within the 1980 campaign. There was the Reagan team, as you said, and the Bush team. Mm-hmm. But it seems a more difficult way to conduct a campaign unless, of course, the motivations and operations of the 2 teams are completely separate.
Look, the bottom line is the Reagan side. If you recall, let me give you a little bit of history. At the 1980 Reagan-Bush convention, where I was on the 3rd floor down from the top of the Renaissance Center there with Reagan's, room. He and Nancy were on the top floor, and the kind of VIPs who were on the second floor, and we were on the third floor, and I was running the speech writing and policy office there at the campaign in Detroit, Michigan in the summer of 1980. Even then, it was, many people don't remember this, but Reagan needed to choose a vice presidential running mate. He didn't want George Bush. He was originally, Henry Kissinger came in and tried to talk Reagan into having Gerald Ford, who had already been president for a partial term and then wasn't reelected, to have Gerald Ford as his running mate if Reagan would agree to have a co-presidency, because Ford had already been president. Of course, Reagan rejected that. Reagan took a risk in rejecting that, though, because he wasn't clear that he was going to win the election, because we assumed Carter was going to do everything he could to bring the hostages home and might be at that point and might be successful. So then George Bush Sr. Was proposed, and even at that time, it's now clear in hindsight that George Bush Sr. already had his people planning to sabotage Carter's rescue attempts, and at that point, Carter's military hostage rescue attempt had already been sabotaged by Bush Sr.'s people in the CIA and their special operations forces compadres. So Bush Sr. basically came in and said, you make me your vice presidential running mate. I have a secret. We can win the election. We can interfere with Carter's attempts to bring the hostages home. And paradoxically and rather sinisterly, it was George Bush Sr., who then was made Reagan's vice presidential running mate, who started putting out that Carter was going to have an October surprise, that Carter was trying to bring the hostages home, and that there was something somehow too political and sinister about this, absurdly. He was president of the United States. So it was Bush Sr. who became Reagan's vice presidential running mate, who started putting out that line and used the word October surprise himself, which then I took up for the October surprise meeting because it happened in October in Paris. So people just need to understand that the two sides of the campaign were very different. They, of course, worked together once Bush Sr. came on board. But the Reagan side didn't really trust the Bush side. Now, that might have been true the other way around. I want to jump forward a little bit in time and remind people, this is in my book, October Surprise, towards the end. But there was an assassination attempt on President Reagan shortly after he became president. And the night or the next night, George Bush Sr., of course, he would have been the chief beneficiary. He would have moved up to the presidency if Reagan had been killed, as was clearly the plan. John Hinckley was one of the two shooters. There's reason to believe there was a shooter on the roof as well. But for the public, for the official story, it was just John Hinckley. And John Hinckley's brother and one of George Bush Sr.'s sons were already pre-scheduled to have a celebratory dinner right after the Reagan assassination attempt. And John Hinckley, the attempted assassin, father, Hinckley Sr., is the person who put George H.W. Bush Sr.'s name and nomination for the presidential nomination on the floor of the 1980 Republican Convention, where I was in Detroit, Michigan. And he, of course, lost to Reagan that vote from the floor. It was John Hinckley, the assassin's father, who was so close to Bush Sr. that he put his name in nomination to be president, and then his son was going to have a celebratory dinner right after the assassination attempt. So there's good reason that the Reagan side didn't trust the Bush side, right?
Yes, I think by 1980 there were already probably a plethora of reasons not to trust the Bush family. But I want to bring up someone on the American side who will become vital to the telling of this story. Now, William Casey is a pretty familiar figure to the students of Iran-Contra, or Bob Woodward's dubious deathbed scene in Vail. But who was he in 1980?
Right. Well, William Casey, interestingly, going back in history, William Casey was a very important person in the OSS, which later became morphed into the CIA after the end of World War II. But during World War II, William Casey was a top spy for the West. for the OSS. He personally ran Allied spies inside Hitler's Nazi Germany during World War II. So he was, he was perfectly qualified to be CIA director, right? But at the time of the 1980 Reagan-Bush Sr. campaign and election, William Casey had been, I think the highest public position that he had held was as head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. But of course, he'd been a top spy for the West in World War II. So at the time of the campaign, he was not Reagan's first campaign manager, by the way, in the 1980 Reagan campaign against Carter for the presidency. He was the second campaign manager. The first campaign manager, I believe, was Black. But he was kicked out, and Casey was brought in. Now, this is a very informed opinion, but I believe that Casey got to Reagan and told Reagan, you bring me in as campaign manager and I can get you elected because I have a way to interfere with Carter's attempts to bring the hostages home. I believe that was happening way back in the spring of 1980, just before when I believe Casey became campaign manager in around March of 1980, and that was just before the Bush side of the George Bush Sr.'s people inside the CIA and Special Operations Sabotage Carter's Desert One military attempt to rescue our hostages. So that's who William Casey was. So he was campaign manager beginning in the spring, his second campaign manager to Reagan. He was campaign manager before the June or July, I think it was July, Republican convention where I was in Detroit, Michigan. And he remained campaign manager throughout the campaign. But what's important about William Casey is that William Casey, unlike George Bush Sr., who has been vice presidential running mate of Reagan, William Casey held a number of meetings with top Khomeini representatives in the lead up to the critical October 18th, 19th, October surprise meeting in Paris, the one that really mattered, but there were pre-meetings to that. There were meetings in a hotel, in the Mayflower Hotel, and I recall it was March of 1980, between William Casey and Jamshid Hashemi. Jamshid Hashemi worked with the CIA, and he was the brother of Cyrus Hashemi, who was Khomeini's banker in New York, okay? So Casey was already feeling out the possibility of working with Khomeini behind the scenes to interfere with Carter's attempts to bring the hostages home and therefore win the election against Reagan as early as March 1980 with the Mayflower Hotel meeting. Then there were other meetings. There was one in April at a restaurant in New York City. Then Casey also was at meetings in Madrid in July and August, leading up to the critical meeting where he and George Bush Sr., vice presidential running mate with Reagan, both met at the Ritz Hotel in Paris with Khomeini's top representatives to seal the deal. Now that took what's called a principal. Casey wasn't a principal, he was just a campaign manager. It took one of the two candidates, Reagan or Bush Sr., to give their bona fides at that Paris meeting, and that individual was George Bush Sr., who recently passed away.
So at what point in this process do the representatives from the United States seek assistance from the Israelis?
Another good question. By the way, I think people should know that you've really done your homework. I know that you've read my book, October Surprise. I believe that you've read some of the other books. I should say now, there are other books. Mine was the first by 2.5 years at least. The next book was by the same title, by the way. He took my title, October Surprise. And that's by Gary Sick, S-I-C-K. Gary Sick was a top analyst in naval intelligence and fluent in Farsi, the Iranian language. And he had been in the National Security Council in the West Wing of the White House as the top Iran expert for President Carter throughout the hostage crisis, okay? And stayed on a bit into the Reagan-Bush Sr. White House when they took over. So Gary Sick wrote the second book, called also October Surprise. The third book was by Robert Perry, who unfortunately passed away not too long ago. He founded consortiumnews.com, which is a must site for anybody who wants to know what's really happening in the world. Bob Perry wrote the third book on the October Surprise, just on the October Surprise. It's called Trick or Treason, The October Surprise Mystery by Robert Perry, P-A-R-R-Y. And the fourth book on the October Surprise is called Prophets of War by Ari Ben-Menashe. And this gets to the question about the Israelis, because Ari Ben-Menashe, his book, the first half of his book, Prophets of War, is about all about the details of how the Israelis, how the Israeli special operations and IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, Ben-Menashe had been with the IDF as an intelligence analyst, but he was an honest person, and he decided he was going to tell the truth, kind of like Michael Cohen finally coming clean, right? Yesterday. So Ari Ben-Menashe was with the Israeli Defense Forces, and he was at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. I don't know if he was doing security, but he was there outside. He saw who went in, who came out, and he has gone public with this. And the bottom line answer to your question is that the Israelis were the middlemen from the beginning. Now, just think about it. If you're just private citizens, as Reagan-Bush Sr. and William Casey were, and the others, they were just private citizens. They weren't in any official elected position at all during the campaign in 1980. So when they started meeting behind the scenes with these top negotiators for the Ayatollah Khomeini, then holding at least 53 of our citizens hostage in Iran against their will, they didn't have any authority to order the release of U.S. arms as a quid pro quo for the agreement, right? And the Iranians demanded, and that's to be expected, a kind of bona fides, a proof that you can come up with the arms. So during the campaign, they had to get those arms, those bona fide arms shipments, which were sent in late October, right after the October Surprise meeting. They were sent to Iran. Some of them were with the intermediaries of the Israelis. And then, of course, the Israelis needed to have those arms replenished. And if you recall, years later, in late 86 and 87, when Iran-Contra happened, that they kept talking about when the Israeli connection as the middleman in the Iran-Contra, in the Iran gate side of the arms shipments to Iran in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. You kept hearing about the Iranian or the Israelis needing their arms replenished. They had sent their own arms to Iran during the campaign even. And there was also a treasonous drawdown. This is in my book, October Surprise, a whole chapter on it. There was a drawdown of the most top secret arms stores in the world in Europe. And they were called the Stay Behind stores or the Gladio stores. And those arms were stashed away at locations around Europe. This is still during the Cold War, remember, in case there was a Soviet invasion through the Fulda Gap in Germany and into Western Europe, Central and Western Europe. They were going to be arms that the special operations saboteurs would know where to get to fight the Soviets if they, during the Cold War, came in and tried to invade and occupy Western Europe. So those stores were drawn down also during that critical period after the Paris October Surprise meeting in October 1980 to send to Iran as these, quote, bona fide, unquote, arms shipments. So the Israelis all along, including in the Iran arms side of Iran-Contra, later in the 80s, the Israelis were the middlemen then as well. Yeah.
Well, at this point, what can really be said? So for anyone out there who thinks or who's heard the news media repeatedly states that Israel and Iran are
enemies.
Yes, some kind of mortal enemies dating back thousands of years. Remember, that this is but one October surprise. These things are happening covertly all over the world and in America, where supposed enemies are acting as arms traders and mediators and conduits by which very profitable defense deals can be made. But by keeping us at odds, and frankly keeping the average Israelis and Iranians at odds, the conditions of this perpetual war state that we're all under are set. And then it's under those conditions, and really, frankly, only under those conditions, that operations like the October Surprise can commence, with Israel then serving as the arms trader to Iran, Menachem Begin to the Ayatollah Khomeini. And still, we believe that our news media is legitimate.
Well, they don't give you all of the truth anywhere close. They don't give you what really matters to understand current history. And just even recent history. They don't give you anywhere close. I want to remind people, again, why should you care about this now? In the 2016 election between Trump and his Hillary Clinton, Trump's people called on. They used the word October surprise. They said there's going to be an October surprise, and the October surprise is going to be when Assange and WikiLeaks releases another cache of Hillary Clinton and Podesta emails. They actually called it the October surprise. Okay, so the original October surprise really matters because we're living through right now the consequences of the Trump campaign effectively pulling something almost parallel with Russia that the Reagan-Bush senior campaign pulled with Khomeini's Iran. We're holding our hostages. I actually believe that the October surprise back in October 1980 was far more treasonous than anything that Trump could have done with Russia. But that remains to be seen when we finally get Mueller's whole story. We don't know yet, do we? But what we do know is that the Trump campaign called it the October surprise when WikiLeaks was going to be, they knew in advance WikiLeaks was going to be releasing another email dump.
Well, this brings us to October of 1980, a consequential month. And I've read at this point, President Carter believed that he had a secret deal of some kind in place with the Iranians. Now, he may or may not have, but he believed that he did. That's what I've read. But what really appears to be happening is that the Iranians are dealing with both sides, seeking the best deal that they can get for their commodities that they have, which are the hostages. Now, the Reagan campaign is now going to make an effort to seal this deal. That would happen in Paris. So what happens, who attends, and why is the Paris meeting the most important of this story?
All right. Well, to my understanding, Carter didn't have an agreement. He was trying to get one. And it was when our sources, our spies basically, inside the Carter White House and the State Department and the military let us know that Carter was negotiating seriously, trying to get the hostages out as October 18th, 1980 approached, that we activated our on-the-shelf October surprise sabotage plan by sending William Casey and Vice Presidential candidate George Bush Sr. to Paris to meet with the Khomeini representatives. So I don't believe that Carter had an agreement. That was then undone. But that's my understanding. But he was very close. And we believe, because he was president, that of course he had the wherewithal to send them arms under the table, just as the Reagan-Bush campaign did just a few days later, right? Okay. So that answers the question as to whether Carter actually had an agreement that was then reneged on. I don't believe so. So moving on to the real October surprise meeting. This is a meeting that happened on October 18th to 19th, 1980. Now, believe it or not, they're still in circulation in the United States. I kind of collect them whenever I see one. Dollar bills where somebody has either made a stamp with an ink pad, and they stamp on there, wherewasgeorge.com, wherewasgeorge.com. And what that sentence on the money, I don't know if that website is still active or not, but it was for decades. What that website was about is all of the alibis that George Bush Sr. came up with for where he was on October 18th to 19th, the night of October 18th into the 19th of October. He came up with all of these alibis that all fell apart and were proven to be false, including there were FBI investigations of the October surprise that proved that his alibis were false. All three of his alibis were proven to be false. And if you don't have it already, I will send you a link to a really fine article by Robert Perry, who wrote this third book on the October surprise. Trick or Treason, the October Surprise Mystery is the title of his book. His website, he's no longer with us, unfortunately, but his website and the great articles there continue. And it's called Consortium, CONSORTIUM news.com. And if you go there and you click on the horizontal menu at the top under Archives and scroll down a little bit to the October Surprise X files, you will see the formerly classified documents that were leaked out or released under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, that are now in the public domain that prove the October surprise was true. And as I mentioned, there also have been deathbed confessions by the former head of French intelligence who did the security and logistics for the October surprise, October 18th to 19th meeting, and also a deathbed confession by Dwayne Dewey Claridge, top Bush Sr. CIA covert operator who was directly involved at the center of the October surprise deal in October of 1980. Both of them have deathbed confessions to their biographers or to journalists. And believe it or not, only a few years ago, Dwayne Dewey Claridge's deathbed confession was revealed in Newsweek magazine, which is owned by the Washington Post Consortium. And the headline was, "The October surprise was real!" Exclamation point. It only took decades for the mainstream media to acknowledge what my book proved back in when it was published on May 12th of 1989. By the way, I forgot to mention something. This is important. My book was published right after George Bush Sr., who had done the October surprise meeting deal, became president. So he had already been president from January 20th, 1989 to when my book came out on May 12th. Now, of course, his people were tracking. He, of course, CIA headquarters is named after him, right? The George H.W. Bush CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. George Bush's people, he was then president of the United States, were tracking everything to do with my book, October Surprise, you can imagine. It came out on May 12, 1989. On that exact day, the president of the United States, George Bush Sr., decided, he was so scared of my book, he decided to make it literally a federal case out of my book. He sued one of my three top, then anonymous, now known witnesses, eyewitnesses to the October surprise meeting in Paris, where George Bush Sr. was the chief negotiator with William Casey, with the Khomeini representatives, to delay the release of our hostages for a promise of at least $5 billion of arms, which started flowing right after they took over the White House. Actually started flowing in late October in the bona fide arms shipment. So anyway, my point here is that George Bush Sr. Was involved with this October surprise meeting right from the beginning. And literally the day my book was published, as President of the United States, he ordered his Attorney General to sue one of my three top witnesses in my book. There were many witnesses, but they were the three eyewitnesses. His name was Richard Brennicky. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. He died a few years ago. But Richard Brennicky had been involved with Iran-Contra, flying drugs and arms in and out and such, out of Mena, Arkansas. And Richard Brennicky was one of my sources. And Bush's Attorney General sued Richard Brennicky for allegedly lying for what was in my book on the day my book was published, to try to prevent it from getting any positive reviews, from getting any positive play in the mainstream media. That did not succeed. My book was on the cover of Publishers Weekly, by the way. And it was also the book of the month for an entire month of from mid-May to mid-June of 1989. It was the book of the month in all of the Walden bookstores across the United States. There are about 1,000 of those bookstores. Big posters in the windows and literal pyramids of my books right inside the front door. So that didn't work. But George Bush Sr., then president, did sue one of my chief witnesses and made literally a federal case out of the claims of my book, that George Bush, then president, had committed high treason to gain the vice presidency, and then towards the end of my book, his people had tried to kill President Reagan in the Reagan assassination attempt to put himself in office. It's a very, very evil man who recently passed away. So it took almost exactly a year. On May 4th, a little bit less than a year, May 4th of 1990, up in federal court in Portland, Oregon, Richard Brennicke was found innocent after only a few hours on all 60 counts of allegedly lying about what was in my book. And it was national headlines all across the country and the world. And I'm telling you, that shook up the Bush Senior White House. It really shook up the Bush Senior White House. So the President of the United States, George Bush Sr., made a federal case out of the claims of my book that he had committed high treason, and I was vindicated in federal court in Portland, Oregon on May 4th of 1990, along with one of my key witnesses in my book, Richard Brennicke. So I just wanted to make that point. And all of that was about the October surprise Paris meeting. So is it important? Yeah, it was important enough for President Bush Sr. to make a federal case out of it and lose it big time, all 60 counts, less than a year later.
But what happens at that Paris meeting, and who's there?
Well, this is what we know. We know that William Casey. There were two plane flights, by the way. One of them was the pilot was Heinrich Rupp, R-U-P-P, who was a longtime CIA pilot, along with Richard Brennicke and good friends with Richard Brennicke. Way back in their lives. And Heinrich Rupp, I believe Heinrich Rupp flew William Casey, and there was a separate plane flight with George Bush Sr. Heinrich Rupp from his cockpit saw George Bush Sr. on the tarmac. Alexander de Morench, who was the head of French intelligence at the time, on his deathbed, as I mentioned. And this is, by the way, became public by his biographer. Alexander de Morench told his biographer, there's a book on Alexander de Morench. I can't remember his biographer's name at the moment, but his biographer went public after de Morench died, and went public with the fact that de Morench acknowledged to him that the October surprise meeting was true, and that George Bush and William Casey were in fact there. In fact, he mentioned William Casey. I don't think de Morench personally mentioned George Bush Sr., although he might have, but certainly William Casey was at the October 18th, 19th Paris meeting in the Ritz Hotel with the Khomeini representatives doing the deal. And his biographer, after de Morench died, went public with the fact that de Morench said, but don't put that in the book, because I don't want to cause Casey or anybody in his family any problems. But he felt that it was his duty, the biographer did, to tell the truth. And he did tell the truth publicly after de Morench's death. So we do know that George H.W. Bush Sr. was there. He was then Reagan's vice presidential running mate in the 1980 election against Carter. We do know that William Casey was there. And by the way, I could go into all the details of how we know, but I would refer people to these books, to my book, October Surprise, to Gary Sick's book, October Surprise, to Robert Perry's book, Trick or Treason, the October Surprise Mystery, and Ari Ben Menashe's book, Prophets of War. The first half of that book on the Israelis being the middleman for the vast majority of the arms shipments. About $2 billion worth, by the way, out of the United States, even though they were flown out by the Israelis. And that was, of course, after Reagan and Bush gained the White House. So these are the people who were there. Also, Richard Brennicke claimed that he was at the Ritz. A man by the name of Oswald de Winter, who was Source Y, Mr. Y in my book. He swore me to anonymity for my book, but he later became, his identity was made public by Robert Perry, and Robert Perry did two Nova specials on the October surprise, in one of which he interviewed Oswald the Winter, who was a top. Oswald the Winter, by the way, was the Pentagon's liaison to Operation Gladio, the NATO Operation Gladio that perpetrated false flag terrorist attacks against innocent civilians throughout the Cold War in Western European countries to blame on the socialists and the communists when it looked like they were going to win elections. They're really evil people. They pull false flags all the time, like 9/11 was a false flag. So we know that these witnesses were there. I've personally flown to the Ritz Hotel twice to Paris, and I've interviewed the head of security there, who was, at the time when I interviewed him, he had been head of security for the October surprise meeting. And I interviewed him in person, and he took me around to the places where the meeting was held, the service elevator where they came in the back so they wouldn't be seen in the front, probably the same service elevator that Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed, that famous last video of them just after they got out of the service elevator before they went out the back door and got into the Mercedes, just before they were killed in the Alma Tunnel. So all of these people were at this meeting, but the important thing about the meeting was that the deal was done. George Bush Sr. had to be there because they had to have a principal, one of the two main candidates. And the agreement was that the hostages would not be released before the election, which was November 4th, 1980. Before the election, because that was what was necessary to keep Carter from winning. Okay, so they agreed to that in exchange for some bona fide armed shipments, and Israel was the middleman for those, and they were sent to Iran as bona fides proof of the agreement in late October of 1980, before the election of November 4th, 1980. And then after the agreement was reached, then of course there were the agreement was for a minimum of $5 billion worth of arms shipments to be sent to Iran by whatever means, and there were many means, and this is detailed in my book and the other books on the October's Prize, especially Ari Ben Menash's book, Prophets of War, because the Israelis were the main middlemen who actually flew them to Iran. So $5 billion minimum of arms did flow once Reagan and Bush came to White House. And this, by the way, was on the front pages of our nation's newspapers, including the front page of the New York Times. There was an article by Cy Hirsch, who was one of the world's foremost investigative journalists, to the effect that a minimum of $2 billion of arms from the United States went from arms storage in the United States into the Pinal airfield in Marana, Arizona, and from there were flown out, amongst others, by Israelis to Iran. Now, this was, of course, very, very sensitive, because to this very day, the vast majority of the people of Iran believe that their country is an enemy with Israel. But that wasn't true at the time of the October surprise deal and the Reagan-Bush campaign, quite to the contrary at the top.
I know that there are some aircraft tires and some other things that began flowing into Iran in late October 1980.
Right.
But at what point does America really begin seriously shipping arms to Iran? Is it before or is it after Inauguration Day in January of 81?
Yes. So these bona fide shipments, and there's a man by the name of Hushang Lavi, who's very important, who is involved with not just aircraft tires, but spare parts for Iran's fleet of F-4 fighter jets. Now remember, in September of 1980, Iraq had attacked Iran, and the Iran-Iraq War had started. The Iran-Iraq War lasted for 8 years. At least 1 million people died in that war, okay? And so the Iranians were desperate to fight Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War that already started about a month before the November 4th presidential election. They desperately needed parts and tires, which are parts, for their F-4 fighter jet aircraft, which, of course, the Shah had purchased from the United States. So they needed U.S. spare parts and tires. And Hushang Lavi was, I believe, an Iranian-American. I'm not certain he was an American citizen. I believe so. But in any case, he was born in Iran. So Hushang Lavi, L-A-V-I, was a very important player early on in the pre-Paris October surprise run-up meeting that started in as early as March of 1980. Hushang Lavi met with three of the top officials of the Reagan-Bush campaign, the National Security Advisor to Reagan, Richard Allen, who became his first National Security Advisor in the White House later, Bud McFarlane, who became Reagan's second or third National Security Advisor in the White House, and Lawrence Silverman, who is a major federal judge now. By the way, one of the federal judges in the three-judge panel who let Oliver North off the hook, right? Who voided his indictment. Okay, so this is all a pretty tight knit group of conspirators here at the very top. So Hushang Lavi was very central to the attempt to get a deal started as early as March of 1980 with these top officials of the Reagan-Bush campaign, and they met at the LaFont Plaza Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. And the important thing about that meeting, which was in September of 1980, right after the Iran-Iraq War started, is that it's the one meeting in the whole lead up to the big October surprise meeting in Paris on October 18th, 19th, 1980, starting as early as March, and then in June and July and August, and then finally September and then October. In those very earliest meetings, including in September of 1980 at the LaFont Plaza Hotel, Hushang Lavi was the main person meeting with the top officials of the Reagan-Bush campaign. And this is, by the way, on the Reagan side, not the Bush side, interestingly. And it is the one meeting that is acknowledged by Allen, McFarlane, and Silverman. All of the other October surprise meetings are still denied, despite all of the documents that prove it having now been released, and you can read them on consortiumnews.com. Click on archives in the menu at the top of the main page. Scroll down a bit to the October Surprise X-Files, and you will read all those formerly classified documents proving the October surprise. So Hushang Lavi was a very important player, and he was amongst many, many October surprise players who were murdered, who were assassinated. The very last chapter of my book, October Surprise, is called A Kinder, Gentler Nation, which, as you recall, George Bush Sr., when he became president, in his acceptance speech, inauguration, he said what he wanted was a kinder, gentler nation. Well, the last chapter of my book is the dozens and dozens and dozens of perpetrators and people who knew too much about the October surprise, who were assassinated, who were murdered, including Hushang Lavi. So that's what a George Bush Sr. kinder, gentler nation really looks like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 1,000 points of light, right? Well, Reagan defeats Carter, as we know, and the country in the end hadn't really been happy with the Malay speech. They felt like Carter was really almost blaming them for the funk that the nation found itself in 1980. The long gas lines were new and they were troubling to many. Interest rates stifled home buying, which for many is the American dream. And then, of course, there's the despair of the 400-plus day hostage crisis. But what were the effects of the Iranian hostage crisis within the Reagan campaign? You were there. Was it something that you discussed in casual and strategic conversations every day?
All the time. All the time. It was the backdrop to everything. Everything. It was our greatest fear. And it was, we put millions of dollars into these focus groups and this huge computer number crunching of the data from all of the focus groups in individuals' houses across the country, went into the big Cray computer. I believe it was a Cray computer at Brigham Young University in Utah, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and crunched the numbers and came out with, the critical window if Carter brought the hostages home between the 18th and the 25th of October, 1980. He was going to get between 7 and 10 percentage point boost in the polls, and even though Reagan was ahead 3-5, it wasn't going to be enough if Carter brought the hostages home. Bringing the hostages home in that critical time window in mid to late October of 1980 was everything for winning or losing the White House.
Well, the hostages come home on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981, and they do so publicly due to the Algiers Accords. Now, the public had not really been made aware of the October surprise and wouldn't for a few years later when you began writing the first book on the topic. Congratulations on that. Now, it had to be an interesting process since those that you needed to quote are people that you had both worked with and known, but it was still a very secretive story, and to try to get them to come clean couldn't have been easy. So it was a bit of a risk for you and for them. But when you started the process of writing the October surprise, who was really encouraging to you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, actually, it's a little different than what you described.
How so?
I'm a pretty gutsy person, right? So it wasn't just people I knew. I will tell you the first person I spoke to, my first source, besides my own witness, as I mentioned before, in the operations center, where I was told we don't have to worry about an October surprise. Dick cut a deal. That's the exact quote I was given in mid-October of 1980, which was just before the October surprise meeting, as it turns out, in Paris, okay, in the most secure headquarters of the Reagan-Bush campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. So I had my own experience, and also my best friend in the Reagan-Bush campaign. He was on the Bush side, but he was unusual. His name was Michelle Smith, M-I-C-H-E-L. We called him Mickey. Mickey Smith was the Bush side of the campaigns, and therefore the Reagan-Bush campaign in total. He was the Iran expert. He spoke Farsi. He had been posted. He was CIA, I'm sure. He never admitted that to me, but I'm sure he was, because he was a Bush guy. But anyway, he had been I believe he was CIA, but he was undercover of being a Commerce Department representative, attaché, at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, not too long before the Iranian Revolution and the students took over our U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took the hostages captive. So he had come back to the States, and he was in the campaign, and he was my best friend. And he told me about the Hushang Lavi meeting. That was how I first learned about that. And then, of course, I interviewed Hushang Lavi. One thing leads to another. And after I interviewed Hushang Lavi, then, of course, there was a lot that was already in the news once Iran-Contra came out, except you had to know the real context of the October surprise, which I already saw the big picture of, in order to know what that was really about. And then the next major witness who I interviewed was a man by the name of Mansour Rafizadeh. Now, I've mentioned him before in this interview. Mansour Rafizadeh, he's mentioned in my book, October Surprise. He was the Shah of Iran before the Khomeini regime revolution, of course, that kicked the Shah out of Iran. He was the Shah's head of Savak, his top Savak representative undercover as being a delegate to the United Nations in New York City, in Manhattan. And so Mansour Rafizadeh had written a book called Witness. And I read that book, and it was about what it was like to be under the Shah in Iran as the top official, top officer in the Savak, which was the dreaded secret service, trained in part by the Mossad, okay? And so he was a dreaded individual in Iran. And, of course, after the Khomeini revolution, the Iranian revolution, he, of course, could not go back to Iran. So he was living in Peachtree. I doubt he's alive still, but he was living then in Peachtree, New Jersey, in upstate New Jersey. So I read his book, and towards the end of the book, it talks about how close he was to George H.W. Bush. because he worked for the CIA and he worked directly with Bush on the Iran side of things. And I thought to myself, well, I'll bet he knows about the October surprise. So I also read in his book that he knew about the Carter hostage rescue attempt being sabotaged. And so I figured, oh, well, I'm going to find out more about that. So I appeared at his doorstep. I literally, I was working for a printing press here in Monterey, California. I saved my money. I flew into Newark, New Jersey, and got myself a taxi, and I knew his address through his publisher. And I appeared at his doorstep, and I introduced myself, and he had me in. The Iranians are very what's the word, hospitable people. They pride themselves on being good hosts. And I was invited to stay. It's an extended family. His mother was living with him, and she was in her 80s or 90s, and, their dog. And so they put me up in a guest room, and I had a great time. And it turns out he had his original book manuscript was 1,500 pages, and it only came out for about 350. I got to read the whole thing. I got to interview him for 3 days and nights on tape. So he became a major source for my book. And one thing went to another. And then I started doing what you have to do a book is you have to do a chronology. History is about a chronology. So I had a 76-page detailed reference chronology. You have to see what comes in what chronological order to have a hypothesis about what could have caused what, okay? Because something that comes after can't cause something that came before. So I had my chronology, and believe it or not, when I was in the White House, the senior White House correspondent, Sarah McClendon, was my political godmother. I was so close to her. I'd stay at her house or her apartment whenever I was in D.C. She worked late at night, sometimes through the night, and she'd say, oh, honey, just use my bed. Don't even bother going into the guest bedroom. I was that close to Sarah McClendon, the senior White House correspondent. So when I got my 76-page outline of from public sources. Now, this is after Iran-Contra started spilling out in the press, by the way, which I covered. You can imagine. I read everything. And so I had my chronology, and I sent a copy through the mail to Sarah McClendon for her comment. And about a week, 10 days later, I get a call from Sarah. If you recall Sarah, she was the very brassy, brazen, outspoken senior White House correspondent, senior even to Helen Thomas. She'd been there through 8 or 9 straight presidencies when Reagan and Bush Sr. took the White House. Nobody could talk back to Sarah. She was in charge of the White House press room, I'll tell you. So anyway, she called me up and she said, honey, she was from Texas, by the way, Texas Observer originally, and then she had her McClendon newsletter. That was the umbrella and auspices under which she was in the White House press room when I met her beginning in early 1981, and we became best of friends. And she called me up and she said, after I sent her my chronology, this was before my book was published, of course, or written, she called me up and she said, honey, you've got to come to Washington, D.C., and you've got to get here immediately. And I said, okay, Sarah, what's going on? What is it? She said, I can't tell you. I said, well, why? And she said, well, there's somebody really important needs to meet with you, and he promised me secrecy, and I cannot tell you, but you know me, I'm your mother, and I'm telling you, you've got to get your tail. So I had to borrow money. I was running a bed and breakfast inn here in the Monterey Peninsula at the time. And so I pulled together my money, and in about a week, I was back there. She had somebody pick me up, take her to her place. She still wouldn't tell me who it was that I was going to be having lunch with at the National Press Club the next day. And when we got to the National Press Club, believe it or not, and even to this day, there is a Sarah McClendon dining room at the National Press Club in her honor. And there was even then, while she was alive. Usually people don't get, dining rooms in their honor at the National Press Club until they die. But there was one there when she was still alive for her round table, which she held once a week. So when we got to the National Press Club, there's a reason I'm telling you this. When we get to the National Press Club, she doesn't go into the Sarah McClendon dining room. She says, he is waiting for you. I'm going to stay in the lobby. He wants to meet with you alone. So I was shocked. I was amazed. I assumed that she was going to go with me and introduce me to this mystery person. But no, she told me what to do, to go around the corner and go down the long, narrow dining area, and he'll be at the last table on the left for two. And sure enough, I turned the corner, and here was a man in full white Air Force dress uniform with all of his ribbons, from all of his service, and his cap, they call it the cover, was on the table, and a black briefcase was on the table. He stood up, military bearing, and as I approached, he put out his hand. He said, "Are you Barbara?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I am Colonel Fletcher Prouty," if you recognize that name.
I do. I absolutely do.
Mm-hmm. And so Fletcher Prouty, helped me in my chair, and we ordered and got our coffee or iced tea or whatever, and he asked the waiter not to come back for a while. And he opened his briefcase. It was all business at the beginning. He opened his briefcase and took out a manila envelope and opened the clasp, took out a sheaf of 8.5 by 11 papers, face down, pushed them across the table. He said, "Can you look at those?" And I turned them over. And it was my timeline, my chronology I'd sent to Sarah. She'd obviously either sent it to Fletch or Fletcher Prouty or made a copy and sent it to him. And then I realized that this was interrogation that was going to happen here. And he looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Did you write this?" And I looked him right in the eye, and I said, "Yes, this is my chronology for my book, October Surprise, that I'm writing." And he said, "Did anyone help you?" And I looked him in the eyes and I said, "No." And he said, "You wrote every word?" Still looking him in the eyes, I said, "Yes, sir." And he looked me in the eyes for about 10 seconds. He obviously was a trained interrogator in intelligence. And he then said, "All right, may I have it? May I keep it?" And I said, "Sure." Passed it back across the table, put it back in the envelope, put it in the briefcase, closed the briefcase, put it down, and then clasped his hands on this little square table and leaned towards me. Nobody else was in this dining room, by the way, just the two of us. And he leaned towards me, and he said, and this is amazing, it told me something very important about what the deep state really is. He leaned towards me, and he said, "The people," this is an exact quote, "the people who run the world are trained at Haileybury Academy in Britain. When you want to join us, just let me know," and gave me his card. Now, of course, I didn't respond. I wasn't supposed to respond then. I was supposed to think about it. Of course, I never responded because I'm your quintessential outsider. To me, 3 is a crowd, I don't want to be part of the inside of anything. I want to expose the inside from the outside. That's my nature. I was born that way. But it was clear to me that I was being recruited for British intelligence. It is surprising. It is surprising, but just think about it. Who really, what we know about the deep state is that you've heard about the 5 eyes, okay? What we know about the deep state is that it is not just the United States. It's the highest levels of the intelligence and military apparatus across the United States, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. 5 eyes. And then you probably throw in Israel and maybe France and Germany. But France and Germany are a lower level. Israel may actually be calling the shots after 9/11. But that will be our next interview, won't it?
Absolutely. And speaking of Iran-Contra, which we've talked about quite a bit tonight, were you surprised that the media seemed so open to the covert operations of Iran-Contra? They seemed to buy that story hook, line, and sinker, but they were so close to the October surprise.
Was I surprised? No. Because Iran-Contra, don't forget, Iran-Contra happened while Reagan was still president and Bush was vice president. That was it first came out, I believe it was November 24th, 1986. in an op-ed piece in the New York Times. It was either the Washington Post, I believe New York Times, by Robert McFarlane, who was then Reagan's national security advisor. And it was a cover your ass, a CYA piece by Robert McFarlane. That was clear. But it gave the tip of the iceberg of what became known as Iran-Contra. And then right after that, Ed Meese goes public with that surprise press conference saying, which was your ultimate quintessential archetypal limited hangout, where they are forced to put out some of the truth to try to prevent the big truth from being talked about, okay? And Ed Meese went public in this public press conference that was picked up all around the world, and he said, well, we've got to admit here that the Reagan-Bush administration has been sending some arms to Iran, not very many, about $150 million worth, and it's to try to get our hostages out of Lebanon. And unfortunately, we just learned from Oliver North that, some of the profits from those arms sales, of which the Israelis were the middlemen, were going to the Nicaraguan Contras in violation of federal law called the Boland Amendment. That was the limited hangout that is known as Iran-Contra. And they were forced to do it. They would have never done that unless they were trying to prevent the big picture of the October surprise from coming out.
And come out it did, thanks to your book, The October Surprise, Barbara Honegger, and the subtitle of that is, Did the Reagan-Bush Election Campaign Sabotage President Carter's Attempts to Free the American Hostages in Iran? And that was from 1989. It is a must-read book. And Barbara, I want to say thank you very much. It was great meeting you in Dallas, and it was great having you on the show tonight. We'll definitely do it again.
Well, you're certainly welcome, and I'd like to close by just reminding people, why should you care about this? This is the third time I've said it, but it's because it's so important. The October surprise not only happened in this treasonous hostage delay for arms deal back in 1980 when the Khomeini regime was holding our over 50 hostages against their will in Iran. That is the original October surprise, but those words were actually used by the Trump campaign for their pre-knowledge, their foreknowledge that WikiLeaks was going to be releasing in late October another document dump, an email dump from Hillary Clinton and John Podesta, her campaign manager. So the October surprise matters. The original October surprise was a treasonous deal between one president, Republican, by the way, presidential campaign with a hostile foreign power. And there was another October surprise, and that was with the Trump campaign with another reportedly hostile foreign power. Now, I'm not going to take a side here on whether the Trump campaign actually did collude with Russia. Do I believe that they did? I think the evidence is already overwhelming. Yes. There's no other explanation for why 14 members of the campaign from Trump on down lied about it. We now have documented meetings with Russians all the way from Putin's top aide in the Kremlin down to the Soviet ambassador to the United States. Multiple meetings that were lied about by Trump and 13, 14 other members of his campaign at the very top, including his campaign manager, Paul Manafort. So do I think that we had an October surprise treasonous deal with another hostile foreign power to fraudulently take the White House that Mr. Trump is sitting in the Oval Office of? Yes, I do. So the October surprise matters, but the Trump-Russia collusion deal was not the first October surprise. The first one was by Reagan's vice presidential running mate, George Bush Sr., who recently passed away, and William Casey, soon to be Reagan's first CIA director, with the Khomeini regime in October of 1980. That was the first one.
Barbara Honegger, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, ST.
I'm ST Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back.
This is Scott Greenberger, the author of The Unexpected President, The Life and Times of Chester A. Arthur. For more on the amazing yet unexpected rise of one of America's most unlikely presidents, listen to episode 42 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Hey, not much tonight. It's vacation time, but the final thoughts are these. Deep Truth Journal is now in. It is in the office, ready for purchase. So the Amazon link should be posted by the time that you're hearing this, and if not, shortly thereafter. And I do mean shortly thereafter. But it's time to buy a copy. This is a magazine that you'll want to read cover to cover, so it is worth it. And feel free to write and tell me what you think of it after you do, by the way. So follow DTJ on Facebook at Deep Truth Journal. That's at Deep Truth Journal. Follow us on Twitter at DTJ Magazine. That's at DTJ Magazine. And then email us at deeptruthjournal@gmail.com. So buy a copy, support good print magazines, and read it into the new year. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact ST Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow ST Patrick on Twitter at MWN_ST Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and ST Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.